Okay, now we're up to Kant. In Kant's preface to the 1787 edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he claims to have done for philosophy what Copernicus did for astronomy. Recall that in the 16th century, Copernicus initiated the modern era in natural science with a fundamental change in our perspective on the universe. He rejected the geocentric view in which all astronomical bodies revolved around the Earth and proposed a heliocentric theory in which the Earth and the other planets revolve around the Sun. Now that change in perspective led to spectacular progress in astronomy and physics through the work of Galileo and Kepler, ultimately culminating in the work of Newton. Now Kant says he wants to do the same for philosophy. And he's identified the root premise that caused all the problems in philosophy. The idea that our knowledge must conform to objects in a world existing independent of us. In other words, all the problems were due to the primacy of existence premise. If we rid ourselves entirely of that premise and consistently adopt its opposite, the problems will go away, according to Kant. In his preface to the Critique, he writes, quote, "Hitherto, it has been assumed that our knowledge must conform to objects. But all attempts to extend our knowledge of objects by establishing something in regard to them a priori by means of concepts have, on this assumption, ended in failure. We must therefore make trial whether we may not have more success in the tasks of metaphysics if we suppose that objects must conform to our knowledge." Knowledge of what? Blank out. Kant continues, "We should then be proceeding precisely on the lines of Copernicus's primary hypothesis." Unquote. Now Kant called this his Copernican revolution. Now if there ever was a big lie, this is it. The actual Copernican revolution was a triumph of the primacy of existence approach. It was brought about by looking outward, focusing on the facts, and rejecting rationalist dogmas. Its conclusion was that the universe is not centered on us and designed around us. It's a universe governed by natural laws that apply to the Earth and stars alike, laws that can only be discovered by observation. But Kant's anti-Copernican revolution consists of claiming that the universe is not only centered on us, it is in effect created by us. He was trying to cash in on the prestige of science to sell his version of the primacy of consciousness, and thereby reverse and destroy the achievements of the actual Copernican revolution. Now Kant's ideas are specifically anti-Copernican in the following way. Kant gave an elaborate philosophic justification for the exact arguments that the Church had used to attack Galileo. Galileo's enemy, Cardinal Bellarmino, had argued that reality was the province of religion, not science. The role of science was merely to describe sense experience with convenient mathematical schemes. In a letter cautioning the advocates of the Copernican theory, Bellarmino writes, quote, "To say that the assumption that the Earth moves and the Sun stands motionless still saves the appearances is to speak well. This has no danger in it, and it suffices for mathematicians. But to affirm that the Sun is really fixed in the center of the heavens, and the Earth is situated in the third orbit and revolves very swiftly around the Sun, that is a very dangerous thing. It may injure the holy faith and render the sacred scripture false." Unquote. So you see what Bellarmino is saying here. He's saying it's okay if what you're claiming, Galileo, is that you've just come up with a convenient mathematical scheme for describing the appearances. But don't make the claim that you've actually reached the truth about reality. Truth about reality is the province of religion, not science. Now, Galileo would not agree that the heliocentric theory was only an assumed mathematical scheme. He said it was the truth about reality, and that was what got him into trouble. Now, Kant is explicitly on the side of the Church here. Reason and science deal only with appearances, not reality. Most of you probably know Kant's infamous line, "I have found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." Now, of course, the primacy of consciousness is not original with Kant. It is fundamental to Platonism and Christianity. Furthermore, the entire modern progression from Descartes through Hume held that we are aware only of sensory ideas or some kind of inner mental state, not external objects. The mind was regarded as an inner theater of ideas, and the problem was to infer from these ideas to the truth about the external world, which presumably caused the ideas. So consciousness was held to be an autonomous realm with only an indirect tie to existence. But even though these early modern philosophers were wrong, there was still a crucial tie between consciousness and reality. Even if we only perceive mental states, it was still regarded as the goal of reason to figure out how those states were related to the actual objects in the physical world. Even if percepts did not give us direct awareness of the world, it was still hoped that concepts, reason, could grasp existence. When Hume argued that reason was powerless to do so, it was considered a disaster. Now, Kant was the one to reject every last remnant of the primacy of existence. According to Kant, it was not the function of reason to grasp existence. Concepts and percepts are completely cut off from the world and function within a realm of the mind's own creation. Now, what material does the mind begin with, according to Kant? What data provide the starting point of cognition? Now, for objectivism, obviously, this is perception. Perception of a world of entities around us. Kant, of course, doesn't believe that for a second. If you ask Kant this question of what cognitive data do we start with, he answers that the question is unanswerable. The raw material of cognition is unknowable and indescribable. Nevertheless, we can know that our minds synthesize this indescribable smear of unknowable stuff and create the world we experience. How do we do it, according to Kant? Well, first we have a faculty that supplies the spatial and temporal relationships, organizing the stuff so that we experience it in space and time. Second, we have 12 innate concepts, Kant's so-called categories, that synthesize the sensations into a world of entities that obey the law of causality and are amenable to our laws of logic. Okay, so the whole spatial temporal world is a product of our mind, organization of this unknowable, indescribable stuff that we start from. And furthermore, the organization, any laws of that natural world are imposed by us on this mind-created stuff. Now, you might say to Kant that you are not interested in the world we supposedly construct in our minds. You're interested in the real world. And Kant would reply, that which exists independent of our forms of awareness is inaccessible to the human mind. The what is entirely inaccessible. We're trapped in a world of the how of cognition that we create ourselves. All we can know is this world of our own creation, the so-called phenomenal world in Kant's terminology. Reality, which he calls the noumenal world, is unknowable. Now, however, Kant adds, this is not bad news. Since we never experience reality, we have no reason to care about it. We live in the phenomenal world. To hell with reality. Now, this is the reason Dr. Peikoff has referred to Kant as the first complacent skeptic. It is radical skepticism combined with a don't worry, be dutiful attitude. Now, I want to illustrate Kant's complacent skepticism by discussing his views of space and time, which are obviously crucial concepts in physics. Now, Kant claims that reason is led into hopeless contradictions when it tries to transcend the phenomenal world and reach conclusions about reality. He gives several examples of such contradictions in the Critique. He calls them the antinomies of pure reason. Now, Webster's defines an antinomy as, quote, a contradiction between two apparently equally valid principles or between inferences correctly drawn from such principles. So an antinomy is a paradox. Now notice that the definition says that the contradictory principles are apparently equally valid. Without that qualification, this would obviously be an invalid concept, since there are no contradictions in reality. But that is not Kant's view. He claims that his antinomies are, quote, natural and unavoidable illusions which human reason must encounter in its progress, unquote. They are contradictions that we arrive at not because we made a mistake, but because we are trying to grasp reality and not humbly limiting our reason to the phenomenal world. Now, the first two of Kant's antinomies deal with space and time. And Kant's procedure is to present proofs for each of two contradictory views, which he calls the thesis and the antithesis. Now, let me give you his antinomy pertaining to space first. The thesis is the universe is spatially finite. Okay, Kant's now going to offer you a proof of that. And he begins his proof by saying, well, assume the universe is infinite. Then it would require an infinite synthesis to think of it, requiring an infinite time. Therefore, the infinite universe is unthinkable, therefore impossible. So the universe must be spatially finite. Now, that's a very bad argument, obviously depending on primacy of consciousness. But actually, we could give Aristotle's good argument for this same thesis, right? That the universe is finite. Aristotle establishes that by arguing that an actual infinity would violate identity. Okay, now, the antithesis. Kant is now going to prove that the universe is spatially infinite, after just proving that it was finite. Well, he starts out in his usual contrary rationalistic way. Assume the universe is finite, he says. Well, therefore, it must be surrounded by empty space. But empty space is nothing, and the universe cannot be limited by nothing. That would imply that nothing exists and limits existence, which is an impossibility. Therefore, the universe must be infinite. Now, Kant gives exactly parallel arguments for time, and it's probably not worth our time to go into it. I think that's enough to give you an indication of the way that Kant argues by manipulating floating abstractions. Now, Kant's primary intention here was not to prove anything about space, time, or the universe. He wanted people to accept his main conclusion, that reason self-destructs in contradictions when it attempts to grasp reality. Now, such contradictions are not evidence of a mistake, as I said. One must simply shrug and humbly accept the fact that our minds are incapable of understanding. We must limit ourselves to describing the phenomenal world. Now, we'll see later that this view of Kant's is essential to the accepted interpretation of quantum theory. For those of you who know some quantum theory, this is the ultimate source of the so-called principle of complementarity. But we get to that in the last lecture of this course on Friday.